Irina Filatova has worked extensively on the history of the ties between Russia and South Africa, including notably the communist movement in South Africa and the problems of race and ethnicity, subjects on which she's authored many articles, edited publications, and now 6 books. In 2014, Media 24 awarded her book, The Hidden Thread, Russia and South Africa in the Soviet Era, which she co-authored with Paula Davidson, that won the Rachmaninov Prize for the Best Non-Fiction Book of the Year. And she's our guest today. Our discussion is going to focus on the history of the study of South Africa and Africa more generally in Russia, including her central role in it. Welcome, Irina.
Thank you very much, Lindie. No central role, but some sort of writing. Thank you.
So I would like to know, thank you, Irina, for opening this world up to us. Could you please tell us about the early study of Africa and South Africa in Russia? Does it predate the 1917 revolution, and how does it develop under Lenin and under Stalin?
I can't say that the Russian African studies predated the revolution. No, it was not right. There were several people interested in Africa, particularly ethnographers, and they wrote mostly about Ethiopia, with which Russia had some sort of religious connection. But that was that. Several people traveled to Africa, notably a famous poet, Russian poet Gumilev, who brought collections to the Ethnography Museum in St. Petersburg. These collections are still there. They were huge, I must say. So that was that. There was no academic study, even of ethnography, which could be called a school or something like that. You know, there was no special institution dealing with African history. That all changed after the revolution. In 1919, Lenin created the Communist International, which was a union of all communist parties which applied worldwide, which applied and which were accepted. You needed to observe several principles and confirm that you agree with several principles to be accepted. So that was Communist International. Its decisions were obligatory for communist parties. But one of its tasks was enlightenment, education of cadres of communists, both in the Soviet Union and abroad. There were several universities attached to the Communist International. There was Lenin School, which was for the Western communists. There was such a thing as KUNMS, the Communist University of National Minorities of the West. There was a University of the Laborers of China. And then there was the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. And that's where Africa fell into. I mean, African students, mostly from South Africa, came to the Kutv Communist University of Eastern Toilers. They started studying there in the early 1930s, but already in the late 1920s, there had to be people who would be teaching them, these students. And the Soviet government or the Comintern officials appointed these people. They were not meant to be specialists in Africa. They were specialists in the Marxist theory, because they were mostly supposed to teach Marxist theory. It was a party school. It was not a proper university. And people who came there were taught all sorts of things, even underground activities. Some went through military training. They were taught arithmetics. They were taught party building and all that. But one of the even the native language, which for Africans was English. amazingly. But they were taught one of their subjects was the problems of country, the problems of meaning their country. And for Africans, the country was Africa. But because it was connected with communism, the majority of students were from the South African Communist Party. I'm not speaking about North Africa, that was a completely different matter. But the South African Party was the only communist party in Africa at that time, so it was mostly South African students there. There was Kenyatta, but the future first president of Kenya. But otherwise, the such people as um, J.B. Marx and Albert Nzula came there in the first black secretary of the Communist Party came there in the late 1920s. Moses Katane. So they all went through this communist school. Now, because the lecturers had to teach them something, they had to know something about the country. So they did study South Africa, and mostly they were interested in the problems which were connected with revolutionary movement, such as labor. What was the laborers in South Africa? Were they really the advanced regiment of the future revolution, or were they not? Was there such a thing as African bourgeoisie, which meant that they were interested in the class system of African society, not just of the white society in Africa. So that is why there were several people who published, who studied these issues, and who published on them. The most important people were three people, actually. Andrea Schick, or Sick, as the English language speakers pronounce him, Sick. Andrea Sick was a Hungarian who was caught in the Russian Revolution. He came with the White Guards to suppress it, but he was completely smitten by its goals and by how it developed. And so he joined the Communist International and became a prominent lecturer in African studies, because he was just sent to that direction, not because he knew a lot about Africa, but he was sent to study it. There was Alexander Zusmanovich and Ivan Petekhin, both of whom did not teach Africa, they taught Marxism. And so that was the main group. There was something that was called kind of research laboratory of colonialism or colonial problems. That was where the main research work was organized, around seminars, around discussions there. Students came there, there was a library there, and that is where some more academics or some more people interested in Africa could participate. They could not teach, they were not members of the Comintern, but they could come and teach. And actually, the first book that came out of this laboratory was the Union of South Africa. It was published in 1931, and I think that it was the first ever book on South Africa published in Russia, I mean academic book. The author was Yuri Gengros, or Georgi Gengros. He was a very extremely well-educated person. He was not an Africanist. He came from a noble family, and ultimately he perished in Stalin's purges. But the book is interesting and very well-informed and written vaguely in the Marxist tradition, although Yug, his pseudonym was Yug, meaning South. He asks questions, for example, class or race, the way of struggle, who are the Afrikaners, etc. So that was that. But within the Kutv itself, the most prominent person was Andrew Sick, who presented his program of the historical study of Africa in 1929. He presented it in this seminar and then published as a discussion project. This was a very interesting program because uh, it suggested the new approaches. What did that mean? Look at Africa from the point of view of Africans and not from the point of view of colonizers. Study Africans, African struggles, what they did, how they felt, etc. And also, you have to study the states, African states, why they came into existence, why they collapsed, why they were finally conquered by the European colonialists. And also, such topics as culture, he suggested that for Marxists it was very important to study African cultures. And the struggle, the labor movement, the African struggle against colonialism, all that, all these topics, which did not exist anywhere in the West at that time, nobody studied them. He said that we should study African parties, we should uh, uh, pay more and more attention to the nuances of the social structures of African states. That was the whole Africa, and of course, South Africa was a part of the program. Now, the program was absolutely innovative, and when it was later published in English, it was a complete discovery for it was first published in the USSR. Paul and Davidson later published an article about Sikh in 1971 and the text of the program itself in 1988. But in English, the program appeared earlier in 1983, published by a South African academic Colin Dutch and his co-author. It was a very important publication, and it provoked a whole debate about this program and about Soviet writing at that time. Now, Sikh tried to implement his vision of this African history, and he wrote 2 volumes of history. And it was published much later, only in the 1970s. He added 2 volumes more to it. It's now a 4-volume publication, which was published in, I think, 1977, 78, and it was denounced as incoherent, backward, and totally outdated. Why was that? Because Sikh, of course, both in the program and in this volume, he wrote in a language and expressed himself in the language which was okay for that time, but which, of course, was completely out of fashion after the Second World War, and particularly in the 1960s and 70s. He spoke about it. The books were called the History of Negro Africa. And Negroes was the word that he used throughout his program and throughout his publications. They all used Negroes, much more seldom they used Africans. That's one thing, but also the publications were paternalistic. They were written from the point of view. They were a bit like missionaries' works, because they were missionaries. They were bringing forward the mission of communist doctrine. And they taught Africans what they should do and what they should feel and how they should behave. And that was, of course, totally inappropriate. And of course, since 1930s, there appeared such a big, huge literature in the West. And by then, of course, what they wrote was outdated indeed. But if the books were published in the 1930s, they would have been a complete revelation, because this was really history and not anything else. Now, there are two last things that I wanted to add about this period. Students, African students, participated in the work in the academic work. What was later in the West perceived as an innovation, such as students writing together with lecturers and publishing together with lecturers and being used as sources, this was all the normal practice in Kut. And in 1933, for example, a book was published by Potechin, Zusmanovich, and Tom Jackson. Tom Jackson was the pseudonym of Albert Nzula. Sorry, Alfred Nzula, not Albert. Albert Nzula. This book was translated into English in 1979 as Forced Labor in Africa, but the original title was again Labor Movement and Forced Labor in Negro Africa. So that's one thing about the participation of students. And the second thing was that there was another center of African studies at that time in Russia, which was the Institute of Ethnography. The Leningrad branch of Institute of Ethnography had an African department in it. It mostly it was not political at all. They studied languages, ethnography, and ancient history. Mostly at that time, ethnography and languages. But they were proper academics, and that school now also mostly forgotten, because 1930s ethnography, you can imagine. Although its founder, Dmitry Alderogi, he studied in the West, and he brought all that wealth of knowledge, acquaintances, and sources to Leningrad.
Thank you very much for that. I want us to speak next about the post-Stalin era and what are the main post-Stalin developments from the mid-50s roughly until the Perestroika era of the 1980s.
Thula, everybody forgot about the Comintern by then. Communist International was unpronounceable, and people who worked there never mentioned it, because after Stalin banned it in 1943, and particularly since late 1930s, when people who worked there, some of them perished in Stalin's Gulag, some of them spent prison in Stalin's Gulag, such as Zusmanovich, for example, whom I mentioned earlier. Some of them, like Potechin, were sacked for various ideological crimes. It was simply not accepted even to ask about Comintern. They were not willing to speak about it. But in the 1950s, mid-1950s, early 1950s even, the study of Africa continued. People who were interested in Africa were scattered in different academic institutions. History of Africa was not taught at the universities at that time. But Alderogi, Potechin, Zusmanovich, they were still there. Leningrad Department of Ethnography, and Alderogi was still working in Leningrad, and Potechin was working in the Ethnography Institute in Moscow. And they created some interesting works, not all of them could withstand the time. But for example, in 1953, I think 53 or 54, yeah, 54. This book was published, which was called Peoples of Africa. It is a huge, huge volume, and it is not a purely ethnographic material. It covers also the struggle, migrations. It covers whatever was known about the opposition to colonialism, and of course the material which was known at that time. It covers the material about ancient African states, etc. What is more interesting for South Africans is this book, which was published by Perestroika in 1956. This one, it is called the Formation of the National Community of South African Bantu, of the South African Bantu. Now, Perestroika at that time had an idea that all African population in South Africa are being sort of integrated into one nation, into one Bantu nation, he called it. He even participated in debates about it in the South African publications. You can find it. He argued about it with such South Africans as Communist Jack Simons and several other people who were interested in the topic. His idea was that there is gradually emerging a South African black nation and a South African white nation, whom he called Anglo-Afrikaners. Which was, of course, nonsense, but he collected a lot of material. It is also a huge book, and that is what was interesting about that. But a completely new period began in 1960. In 1959, a decision was made by the Central Committee to create Africa Institute, and in 1960 it was opened. Very many people, not very many, but gradually it became a huge behemoth whose staff was about 300 people, 300 researchers, I mean, only. And of course, it occupied immediately the predominant position in African studies in the Soviet Union. The first director was Ivan Perestroika, easy to explain. But all the people who started writing, who wrote in the 1960s and 1970s, and whose name became known for their works at that time as sort of prominent Soviet academics, they came to start in Africa Institute in 1960. Now, what was that? What was Africa Institute interested in? Before I go to that, I think that I should say a couple of words about the organization of African studies from that time on in the Soviet Union and now in Russia. The Soviet studies were organized completely differently from the organization of African studies in the West or in Africa. Universities did most of the teaching, and of course university lecturers and professors. There were now African Studies department at quite a number of universities, Moscow State first and foremost, but also Leningrad University, also Institute for Foreign Relations. They all had African Studies. the African students did not study there mostly. It was for the Soviet students. If African students came to the Soviet Union to study, they went to Lumumba University, where there were a lot of Africans from different countries and also South Africans, which were normally presented not as South Africans because they were underground and came by different routes, etc. All of these universities had the staff which was obliged to study Africa, just as their predecessors in 1930s. And so they did write and they did research, but there were no big collectives such as Africa Institute, for example. So we all who worked at the universities, we all sort of participated in debates, discussions, and collective works of the research institutions. Research institutions such as Africa Institute of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, they were where the, well, research work was done. So what was Africa Institute interested in? First of all, it had to start from scratch because very little was known. There were no sources. The tradition of African studies from the 1930s was lost. So they have to accumulate the knowledge. And they started collecting material and they started publishing books about pre-colonial Africa. There were quite a number of them published in the late 1960s. And early 1970s, but that was not perhaps the most important topic. The most important topics was struggle. Struggle, 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 and struggle. Struggle in pre-colonial times, struggle in against colonialism, struggle against colonial occupation. That was one of the biggest topics on which a lot was published. The first of these books was published by Apollon Davidson when a young scholar in African history. In 1958, he published a book which was called Matabele and Mashona in the struggle against colonialism. It was the first book worldwide to be published on this topic. The famous book by Shepperson and Price about the Chilembe uprising was published the same year, but several months later. Yeah, so Apollon's book was just the first. It was not outstanding in terms of how it was written. So there was nothing special by it, but it was reviewed in several Western journals and it was reviewed in several African journals. So that somehow that drew the attention to Soviet African studies immediately. And many other people continued in the same tradition. But the second Apollon's book on this topic was on South Africa, and it was really an outstanding publication. It was published in 1972, and it was called South Africa, the Birth of Protest. And it was a unique publication, first of all, because it appeared very early, 1972, and the way it was written and the sources on which it was based was completely unusual for the Soviet Union at that time. Sources, Apollon managed to get in touch with South African communists and he corresponded with them. The book is devoted to the birth of protest against colonization and against exploitation, 1870-1922. So that was basically before the birth of communist movement. There was a lot about labor movement and socialist movement, and then the birth of Communist Party. So he got in touch with South African communists, and they corresponded with him and brought him some materials. But most importantly, he has managed to get materials somehow by sort of a miracle from the Hoover Institution of War, Evolution, and Peace, and that was really a treasure trove. It arrived to Africa Institute, and these materials are still there. There were quite a number of, rolls, how the archives were put on the rolls at that time. So that was a very, very valuable addition to the literature about protest. I must add that at that time, Soviet Africanists were mostly interested not in South Africa, but in Africa. The other African countries were marching to independence. All sorts of interesting things were going on there. And South Africa seemed to be stuck in apartheid and was going from bad to worse, and nothing particularly interesting was there. So the majority of books on the struggle were published on other African countries, and again, a lot of materials were collected. For example, one of the achievements of Africa Institute was these two volumes, National Liberation Struggle in the Modern Times and National Liberation Struggle in the Contemporary Times. And it really contained a lot. Now, apart from the struggle and getting materials on the pre-colonial history, there was a lot about non-capitalist path of development. Hundreds and hundreds political books were written about it. There were also academic books, I would say dozens of them, and of course, hundreds and hundreds of articles. Non-capitalist path or socialist orientation was the a possibility for African countries to circumvent capitalism, just jump from pre-colonial communalism to socialism. And many African countries were building socialism at that time, and the Soviet Africanists, of course, were interested in that, and of course, they were asked by the government to be interested in that, and they wrote a lot about the process, and there was also we should never forget that we all wrote about under the conditions of censorship and self-censorship. There was strict censorship at different levels, but we censored ourselves because we knew perfectly well what was expected, what was not expected, and what we should write and what we should not write. Of course, there were ways of going around it, but you never knew what could produce objections. For example, even the title of this book, South Africa, Birth of Protest, Apollon's colleagues protested against the word protest. It wasn't labor movement or revolutionary movement or anything like that. It was just abstract protest. So that was not acceptable. Another topic was labor. That was very well-researched topic in the 1960s. Unfortunately, under the censorship again and under the understandings of that time, the 1960s works on that topic were presented as or framed as the study of the advanced regiments of the future anti-colonial revolution or future socialist revolution. Only gradually, when Soviet academics started to understand more and better, know more about the labor movement and, generally speaking, workers in South Africa, they changed their track and presented a more complicated picture of the labor movement with migrations, etc., etc. So that is another topic, but also at that time there appeared quite a number of very interesting works which were not on the main screen, such as works on colonial society, that is trying to understand what was colonial society, what was the African social structures, and were they, here are colonizers and oppressors, and here are Africans who are not participating and being oppressed, or there was some sort of a communication, and how African societies changed under these conditions. There was a very interesting book by my lecturer, Gera Patechina, who was Patechin's daughter, Sketches of Modern Literature of West Africa, in which she discussed the topic of the language of literature under colonialism, what it was. Was it a national literature? Was it not? Did it properly reflect the feelings of the Africans, or did it not? There were books very interesting about African intelligentsia. So there was this accumulation of new works. Now, in 1971, a new center was opened for African studies. That was in the Institute of General History of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. This was headed by Apollon Davidson, and it immediately started on a different track. It didn't write about socialist orientation, and it didn't write about the struggle, because Apollon was convinced that to write about these things properly, you need sources. And in the Soviet Union, we lacked sources on this topic. So the first two volumes that the center published were on the sources of African history, this one, and on history in African countries, which is basically historiography of African countries, what Africans wrote at that time. And of course, it was easier. That was 77 and 79, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. We did have the publications of African scholars, so we knew what they are writing about, and we could write about it. Was a proper historiography. The other topic that the center started was the history of relations between Russia and South Africa, and it was again started by Apollon. The image of a faraway country. This is South Africa, the image of the faraway country. The book was published in 1975, and it was about how the Russians saw South Africa. It was based on Russian primary sources, how Russians saw South Africa in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And then the call of southern seas, it is exactly the same, 79, and this is about late 18th and 19th century. Again, the image, people who got to South Africa, the Russians who got to South Africa, and what they presented. This topic, the history of relations between African countries and Russia, and then the Soviet Union, that remained with that center for a very long time. To end this topic, I must say that these different centers, Leningrad, in Africa Institute, Apollon Center, in the Institute of General History, they all had their profiles. They wrote on different topics, and although we all participated in the works of one another, particularly, of course, Apollon Center and Africa Institute and Moscow State University and all that, but there was a clearly understood and perceived profile in this organization. So Soviet African studies were not monolithic, and they were not all that sort of written in one mode, in one pattern. That is basically the main trends of the Soviet historiography from the 1960s until the late 1980s.
So then I would really like to know, I mean, you spoke about censorship, self-censorship, and, now the Soviet Union is nearing its end. Did Perestroika and Glasnost have an impact on the field of African studies in Russia?
Absolutely. It did affect African studies in many ways. It became a precursor to what happened later in the Russian studies. Uh, uh, First of all, the archives were opened, and people rushed to this, not all of them, of course, but still, people rushed to the archives and they found new sources, and publications of these sources started already then. It continued at a much greater space and much greater pace later, but this work started at that time. People started to write on topic which were not allowed or not expected earlier. Such as Apollon wrote a book about Cecil Rhodes and his time. It was published and it was somehow very strange. It was unusual. Then he published something else which was even stranger. He wrote about Gumilov. Gumilov, I mentioned him earlier. He was a famous Russian poet who was shot by the revolutionary guards right after the revolution. I don't remember exactly when, I think 1921. But before revolution, he traveled to Africa. So that was a book about his travels. This was unthinkable because Gumilov's name was unpronounceable in the Soviet times, and his poetry was distributed, written by hand, rewritten by hand, and copied by hand, and that's how people knew about it. So these new topics, of course, and also the way people started writing, they got more liberated, if you want. They started to criticize the rigid norms of the applications of Marxist theory to Africa because it became possible to pay more attention to earlier Marxist works, which the Soviet academics who studied this pre-colonial Africa and early colonial Africa, they thought that early Marxist work was more appropriate for understanding African society at that time. Of course, it was a very short period. Gorbachev came to power in May 1985, and gradually leave out 85, 86, 87. It is only in 87, 88 that people really understood that something is changing and that it is possible to write what was not possible before. The works about colonial society started to appear at that time. The work's socialist orientation immediately went out of the window as if it never existed. It just was completely dropped like a stone. There appeared more complicated, complex, and interesting topics. And of course, African academics, South African academics, first of all, started to travel to the Soviet Union. We started to meet them and communicate with them, and sometimes even started publishing with them, although, of course, all the major publications in that vein, first of all, the publications about Cold War were to come later.
In 1992, you came to Durban-Westville, and it's your encounter teaching South African students. And I've had the pleasure of reading your memoirs of that time. I found it to be extremely rich, and I was just wondering whether you'd be willing to share with us what that culture shock was. Just, you've spoken a bit about your encounters with fellow academics, but now you're with students and you're working within an administration. And what were the differences between that and your experiences in Russia?
Well, to put it bluntly, Russian students were better educated. full stop. And it was for absolutely understandable reasons. UDW students came from underprivileged background. It was 1992. They came from the system of Bantu education, and they were also the product of struggle and boycotts, and the perceptions of what the university should give them and how to behave at the university were completely different. You know, uh, it was, uh, we have struggled. The university owes us the degrees. So basically, if a student is not getting through, there could be an uprising just saying no, he has to stay, whatever his achievements or underachievements. There were some things which particularly struck me about the perceptions of African students at UDW at that time. Geography remained a complete puzzle. They could not read maps, and there must have been a difference between UDW and Natal universities, because Jeff Guy, head of history, famous South African historian, head of history at Natal, we invited him to give a seminar at UDW, and he spoke about the borders of pre-colonial Africa, how mapping borders of any pre-colonial state was completely senseless, because it was there was never an exact border of any. For example, of the Zulu state, there were different stages of control of the Zulu Empire. You control that territory to such an extent and the next territory to such an extent, etc., etc. So that idea that there was no borders, he asked us how we teach these things to our students. And we said, well, our students cannot read maps. Generally speaking, it's very difficult to speak about any borders because there were second year students who could not show me Durban on map. They did not have geography at school. So it was very, very difficult for them to understand that. There was a problem of language also, because, of course, we taught in English, and their English was very far from perfect, and they had enormous problems in that way. The best way to cope with it would have been to get an intermediary year where this gap could be closed, but practically it was impossible. So you just get on the way you can. There was also the idea they did not understand history the way historians understand it. They often took history as a narrative. You learn the narrative, and you had this narrative at school. Why do you need to repeat the narrative at the university? We already know that, so why do we need to repeat it now? So it's a particular narrative, the truth, and that's it. That was a pity, but of course there were students who overcame that gap with flying banners, and they were rare, but you really needed to be very persistent, and their problems were really, really enormous.
There were two very prominent attempts in the 1990s to sum up the history of the Soviet Union in solidarity towards the liberation struggle. And one of them was Stephen Ellis in 1992, Comrades Against Apartheid, but then there was Vladimir Shubin's, which was first in 1999. It's basically an attempt to eradicate Stephen Ellis and bring in a completely different perspective. What do you think of those two books, and from your perspective?
Stephen's book, written together with Sechaba, and Sechaba was a Tsepo Sechaba was a very important source for him. It is difficult for me to speak about this book because Stephen is a very good historian. He used so many sources, everything available at that time, I think. But he wrote himself and spoke about it later. That it was important to put out this history of the Communist Party and its relations with the ANC early. He wrote about it. It's too early. He can't write a definitive history of this issue because it's just too early, and it was too early. Because, of course, from several points of view, he put it out so early because he said that South Africa was on the cusp of a new era, and it was important to put out that book at that moment. And it was a political decision, and historians should never take decisions to write anything because of the political need. That is one of the big mistakes. Why it was a mistake to put it out so early? Because first of all, he didn't have sources. He didn't have sources. No sources were opened yet. I mean, he didn't work properly in the Russian libraries and in the Russian archives. He didn't know that. The ANC people have not started speaking or writing memoirs yet. He had only one of these sources, and that was definitely not enough. It was just that too little was written, known on this topic at that time. So that definitely spoiled the impression. But there was also another thing. When you write a book, you have to be conscious. I don't know. You have to understand what political situation you are writing it in. And I think that Stephen knew what he was doing. He just decided to ignore the sensibilities of the moment. And the sensibilities of the moment were that, it was until later, much later, it was not fashionable to speak that the ANC was somehow directed by the Communist Party, that it was guided by the Communist Party or something like that. The role of the Communist Party within the ANC was not a fashionable subject at all, and people were annoyed about him writing that. This was a correct question. What was the role of the Communist Party? But first of all, he definitely he definitely didn't like the Communist Party, and second, he definitely did not have the correct material in order to show what was happening between the ANC and the Communist Party. Just compare it with his later book, The External Mission, or compare it with Tom Lodge's book. This is when it became possible to discuss the relations between the ANC and the Communist Party, really. That is why Shubin was so annoyed with Stephen's book. Shubin's book is very interesting. You see, if you could see it, I have exhausted it. It's just completely more or less torn to pieces because I have returned to it many, many, many times. Shubin is no less subjective than Ellis. perhaps, but in a different direction. He also doesn't like to speak about close relations between the party and the ANC. He conceals many things that needed to be said, and he didn't say them. But it is a memoir, and there are many sources which were not and still are not available anywhere else. Some of them have come out later, but many of them have not. Or some of them have not, I would say. So this is a very valuable book in that sense. But again, you have to look at every publication with caution. Because Shubin is not only a historian, he's also a politician and has always been and remains so. What he says and what he doesn't say and the way he says it, it's only I was working on an article recently about Soviet and relations between the USSR and Africa in the late 19th, in the transition period, basically. And it is only at that time, after reading it already 10 times, I discovered the material which refers right to that topic. And it's written in such a way that you wouldn't understand. So it's a very good book, but both of them are sort of ideologically tainted, I would say.
You emphasize essentially the position of the historian and the role of sources, and as they become available. But then I can't help but wonder, how do you respond then to this in your own publication, The Hidden Thread, which has, also taken its place among these publications? I would like to know about your response, your response to what came before, what you placed on the table, and what the response was to your book.
We all have our views, we all have our ideologies, but a good historian, as I was taught, is trying to look at things in a more or less objective way. Of course, Apollon and my hidden thread, I cannot say that there is no ideology there. It is quite obvious that, we have our views. And I do remember when I presented it, there was a South African political scientist present. I would not name her, but she came up to me after the presentation and she said, "How could you do that? How could you do that? This is such liberal nonsense." And if you look at the Amazon, where this book is still there, the very first review, I think one or two, there was something like the usual liberal something. I don't know whether it is so obvious from the book, but my approach was whatever the USSR did well, and when its cause was just and justified, say so. Say so. It's no use to say that the Soviet role has always been bad or something. When I don't like something about what the USSR did, I say so. So that's my approach. But of course, it's not acceptable to many people.
You spoke when you were answering a question earlier about non-socialist orientation and how that was part of the curriculum. You've also written about the lasting legacy of that education, about a non-social, a path capitalist. States of
non-capitalist.
socialist orientation. Let me get it right. States of socialist orientation, not fully socialist, the way the third world could find its own way towards socialism. And it was developed by Soviet theoreticians. And what I'm getting at is your very important work on the lasting legacy, which deserves to be read. And I want to create a platform for it because we're still on that path. People pretend as though they don't notice that the ANC comes out of every summit saying, is the National Democratic Revolution still on course? And they say, yes, it is. And they'll do everything to destroy anybody who wants to derail it. So tell people exactly what the National Democratic Revolution is and how it influences the ANC to the present day.
Well, perhaps I should start with the Freedom Charter. Freedom Charter was worked out before the National Socialist Revolution, the National Democratic Revolution. And that Freedom Charter, when the relations between the USSR and the South African Communist Party were re-established, which happened in 1960 after a long period of, well, not direct communication between them. They were communicating through the British Communist Party, but not much. But Freedom Charter, they brought it to Moscow and they wanted the Soviet advice, the advice of Soviet comrades. What is this a good document or is it not a good document? The Soviets told them that it's good enough for the first stage of the revolution. It's only the first stage of the revolution. Well, if I look at it, it's more than the first stage of the revolution. But then the idea of the National Democratic Revolution appeared. The idea of the National Democratic Revolution was a theoretical approach of Soviet politicians and academics to the challenge of African countries and some Asian countries to build a socialist society in the newly liberated countries. If you look at Africa, there was Ujamaa in Tanzania, there was lyrical socialism in Senegal. There was, what was it called? Human socialism in Zambia.
Humanism in Zambia. Yeah.
Humanism in Zambia. So even Kenya, which never actually built any socialism, it also said that it is building democratic socialism. So socialism was an ideal because it was something that was not connected with colonial powers. Colonial powers were capitalist. That means that we have to do something different. And they tried, and they tried. So the Soviets had to respond to it, but they understood that to accept that they were building socialism would be completely against the Marxist theory, completely, because you couldn't have socialism without working class, without socialist or communist party. You couldn't do that. So they have invented a theory of socialist orientation, and there was a whole architecture of how you could achieve that through reforms. You could achieve socialism through reforms if you can start building it from the top, not from the bottom, not by the class needs or necessities, but you have to have a progressively orientated elite, and that elite should be able to pull through the social structure of the society and to reorganize it in such a way that socialism would become possible. So That was the idea, and it came about first in 1960 as a non-capitalist way of development. The African countries did not like that. What is this? This somehow negative connotations to it, non-capitalist, but then what is it? So in 1963 was a new term introduced, socialist orientation. Uh, National Democratic Revolution was a way of arriving from what they were, from the society that African countries had or Asian countries had, to a socialist society through reforms. National Democratic Revolution had two stages. One stage was democratic reforms, reorganizing some society in a more in a way which would be closer to socialism. For example, the role of the state should be increased and the democratic reforms simultaneously somehow. Miraculously, you increase the role of the state, but simultaneously democracy flourishes. So that's the first stage. And the second stage, you introduce reforms which are really socialist reforms, such as the nationalization of land, such as the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, etc. There was a whole list of these reforms. I don't want to tire you with listing it all, but for the first stage and for the second stage, there was a whole list of these reforms which should be followed, and conditions in which this is possible to do it. Were people who are trying to build socialism now in this way by reforms, they forget that the main condition, or one of the main conditions which was there, was that there has to be the USSR and the Soviet assistance to the people who are doing it. Without that, that would be impossible. And that's what we are seeing now. South African Communist Party and the ANC accepted the National Democratic Revolution as their program. They are trying to follow it. It is not quite working, but that's the only theory which was completely taken from the Soviet world, and they are trying to apply it until now. And that is something that is very difficult to do without the existence of the Soviet Union.
So, Irina, please tell us a bit more about your background and how did it come that you came to focus on South African history? But apart from that, I'm actually also interested in how you ended up living in South Africa.
Well, these are two different questions, Lindie. The first, how I came to specialize in South Africa, I should start with African studies. And more or less by chance, I ended up in African studies because I was at the high school in the early 1960s, and I finished school at 1965. And that was a rather gloomy time in the USSR because the sort of upsurge of optimism after Stalin's death was petering out, and it was somehow getting clear that we are not going anywhere from where we were, at least not much. And so everywhere there was a kind of a feeling that we're being squeezed. I mean, that intellectual life, which was so promising in the early 1950s, not that I remember it much, I was too young, but that feeling of somehow doom and gloom intellectually was setting up in the country. And absolutely by chance, when I was still at school, a friend of a friend invited us both, or rather, a friend of my cousin invited us both to an African seminar in what was called the House of Friendship. And oh, that was so lovely and lively. And, there were African students there who argued about absolutely everything. What was supposed to be a dogma, they argued about it. They discussed openly whether socialism is a good thing or a bad thing. And the discussions were really non-structured. They could go absolutely anywhere. Moreover, sometimes they passed resolutions, and these resolutions, when they found that they were reformulated by the authorities, they objected vehemently. And we were not used to it. So both my cousin and my friend, after one seminar, left, and I stayed. And I went there all the time, and I became the secretary of that seminar. And then obviously after I finished school, I decided that I would go and study Africa. So that's how it ended with me in African studies. I went to Moscow State University. There was the Institute of Oriental Languages, and later it was renamed Institute of Asian and African Studies. So that's where I went, and the teaching was organized around languages. So every year there was a group of a particular language. Of course, at that Institute, African and Asian, every year there was Japanese, Arabic, Hindi, Chinese, and all that. But in Africa, there were a few specialists, so they specialized around one particular language that year. When I joined the university, it was Swahili, so I specialized in East Africa. As a result, the next year there would be Hausa or Amharic or whatever. So that's how I ended up in African studies. And of course, it was also the era of great interest in Africa. It was such an upsurge, liberation and all exciting events, whether it was politically interesting or generally interesting. But there was a lot of attention to Africa in the Soviet Union at that time.
When we're speaking about the study of African history, and is it an origin in Russia or is it after the revolution? Is it correct to assume when did the study of Africa within the system of Russian higher education begin, really, do you think?
Well, you see, there was not African history, because African history, as you know perfectly well, did not exist. African as African, not African as history of Europeans in Africa. But it did not exist either in Europe or in Africa or in Russia. But what was there was a great interest in Africa, and mostly in the 19th century, it was the interest in Ethiopian studies, Ethiopian religion, because Coptic religion in Ethiopia is closely related to the Russian Orthodox Church. And they communicated along the religious lines, and there was an interest in Amharic language, the first in the 19th century, in a very strange sort of, not even in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but the person who first learned Amharic was an academic by surname of Don. And he started that. But then there were other people in the 19th century, Bolotov, Turayev, and other people. They were all concentrating around Ethiopia and Amharic languages and Ethiopian peoples. It was basically anthropological, social anthropology, language, and history started to get into it only very, very gradually. just as it happened in European countries. I think what brought history, in particular history of African peoples, into the frame was really the comment on Communist International. It was not particularly the revolution, but the idea of Marxist approach, that there was needed to be a Marxist approach. And then if it is Marxist approach, you have to study classes, you have to study social groups, you have to study who are the revolutionary forces in that particular surrounding. So that is why the Communist International, that is the organization which was created by Lenin and where African studies first emerged. I must correct myself that, of course, there was another center of African studies at that time, and it was in Leningrad. Leningrad in the 1920s was also the center of African studies under Dmitry Alexeyevich Alderoge, a famous, very sort of venerated academic in basically languages, social anthropology, and history. So that was a kind of a mixture that existed in Leningrad. Leningrad school continued more or less uninterrupted into the war and after the war. Of course, during the war there was an interruption, but after that it was returned to where it was. They created very many interesting studies which were very different from what was going on in the Comintern. Now the structure of the Communist International was very complex and very fluid. But African studies were mostly concentrated in in the Communist University of Eastern Toilers, which was a particular university which was a parallel to the Lenin School, which was another university under the Comintern. Lenin School was supposed to be for communists, from Western countries mostly. Nevertheless, Moses Katana somehow ended studying in Lenin School and not at the Communist University of Eastern Toilers. Group of African students started to come to Moscow to study, and I published an article at first, a long time ago. There was an article about the African students at KUT, Communist University of Eastern Toilers. It was in English. Otherwise, there's a huge, enormous literature about that in Russian, including, again, my very long article about African studies and students and what they were taught and why they were there, etc., etc. So that's quite a big topic. But that is where history started. I mean, history in particular. And of course, everybody now knows about Andrei Sik, and we called him Sik or Sheik. His program, because of his program, which was translated into English by Professor Dutch, Colin Dutch, who really seriously studied Sheik's writing and that program, and very early it was translated into English before it was published again in Russian after it was completely forgotten.
I think he deserves, sorry, Irina, I think he deserves a section all of himself. I just want to get a point of clarification. When you said Alderoga and you were speaking about Leningrad and you mentioned the war, Are we speaking about the First World War and that he was somebody who started
No,
African
no, no,
studies
no, no,
before?
the Second World
Okay.
War, sorry.
Okay. So
There
he's
was,
somebody who comes into the system after the revolution, 1920s, 1930s. Would that be
yes,
roughly correct? Yeah.
Alderogi was directed by his seniors at the Institute of Ethnography, it was called in Russian. Leningrad was, generally speaking, the main center of ethnography, particularly in terms of Africa. But he was directed specifically to study Africa because he specialized in Egyptian languages and ancient Egyptian studies. But then I don't remember the name of a person. It's in all the Roge memoirs, but one of his seniors told him, look, we don't have anybody who is studying Africa. Why don't you go to Germany? It was still possible in the mid-1920s. Why don't you go to Germany and study languages and speak with people who specialize in Africa there? And so Alderogi did and met all the famous German Africanists of the time. So that's how he started his School of African Studies. Returning to the Comintern and Kutv, I just want to say we can return to Sikh later,
Yeah.
but he was not alone. I would absolutely object to saying that he was just the person who started everything, etc., etc., etc. There were several people who studied Africa, and one of the person um, who actually published the first books, including the first book on South Africa, was Georgi Gerngross. Georgi Gerngross, I don't know how to pronounce that name in English really, but it's a German name, just as Elderogi. There was a lot of German people who came from Germany among the Russian nobility. And both Alderogi and Gerngross came from military families of German origin, but Gerngross was a very, very interesting person. He was by far better educated than anybody else connected with Kutv. He never worked at Kutv, but he was coming to the seminars. He was coming to something that was called African Association. How would I translate that? Well, something like Association of African Studies, which was basically a seminar. And for that seminar, she later wrote this program. But Jan Gross published several books, including, I'm looking for the date of History of South Africa. In the late 1920s, he already published these three books. 31, East Africa. 29, Imperialism on the Black Continent. 1931, he published a book which was called Union of South Africa Essays. They were very good books, and they were written in exactly the same tradition. He did not insist that it was a Marxist tradition, but he did write in it. He was criticized because he was not considered Marxist enough. But still, the books were published, and they were very good books. And I'm absolutely sure that Sikh read them and that they discussed things together. There were also people like Petechin, Zusmanovich, several other people, Petechin, Zusmanovich, and well, anyway, that's enough. So That was the collective, and they worked as the collective. They discussed things. So they all wrote in the same tradition. Zusmanovich and Patechin and Albert Nzula, secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa, they published a book in 1933, Forced Labor in South Africa. That book was translated into English in the 1970s when it was, of course, just like 6 books, it was outdated. But at that time, it was written in exactly the same tradition. That is the Marxist tradition. So that's how history appeared. Of course, there was nothing like that at that time in the European countries. So that is the period when Russia suddenly found itself on the forefront of African studies.
So I'm interested, Irina, with this, as you say, forefront and not in the same framework as followed in Europe. Was African studies affected by the purges of the 1930s?
Oh, they absolutely were. First of all, the Comintern period of African studies was very short. It started in the very late, I think, 1929, when they first paid attention to it. And after after 1935, after the 7th Congress of the Comintern, this all stopped. The interest was lost. The African students stopped coming, and several people were purged completely. Patechin was dismissed, Sik was dismissed, Zusmanovich was dismissed, Gerngross was executed in 1937. Several of the former students who were South Africans and who participated in all that were also executed, as we know. Yes, African studies completely stopped by basically in 1937, there was nothing left. And when they were restarted after the war in the late 1950s, very gradually, there were no expertise. There were just a few people who knew something and who were, some of them were really had to be called back and to try to. Moreover, Comintern was completely forgotten. I mean, nobody spoke about it. Nobody spoke about what was going on there. There was always a cloud of secrecy hanging over this organization, over its activities, and over what it did. So even in the 1950s, 1960s, nobody spoke about it. People knew that it existed, but what was going on there, that was all somehow not, it was not bon ton to speak about it. It is interesting that the attitude of South Africans who did come there was approximately the same. They started speaking about that experience only very late in their lives. But when Poland first came to South Africa, Poland Davidson, he tried to interview the last African student who was not, she was an Afrikaner, Betty du Toit. He tried to interview her about her experience. She flatly refused to speak to him. That's how it was. So yes, it suffered a lot from purges.
We just try and excavate a bit. I mean, I cut you off when you were speaking about Enrich Sik the first time around. Whilst you've decentered him as a central figure, nevertheless, his program was an important document. Could you speak about that and also about the African students? What do we know about their experience? What were they being educated for? If they were being educated by the Comintern, I presume there was an element of advancing world revolution, was there? And what was the pedagogical approach that was being followed there?
Look, Sikh wrote this program because he was supposed to teach African students, and he was supposed to study Africa. So he presented this program at the seminar as a discussion document. It was never approved. It was published just as a discussion document. It was never approved. It was never sort of considered a kind of a defining document for African studies, either at the Comintern times or after the war. But the principles that were in the background of that program were, of course, there. Sikh wrote about the need to study African history from the point of view of the Africans, not the Europeans, as Africans as the sort of makers of history, not the subjects of history, not the objects of history. He also stressed the importance of studying the social structure of African societies, the political movements in the African societies, something that nobody ever heard of in Europe. It was completely out of the attention of the European culture or European African studies at that time. He also said that we should speak and study about African authorities, meaning about chiefs, etc., etc. Traditional, he wrote that his terminology was absolutely not politically correct. If you read that program now, everybody would, whoever just had a look at it would tell you that he was a complete and utter racist. He wasn't. It was just the terminology of the time. But what he also said, which I think is interesting for contemporary African studies in particular, is that Marxists should never idealize traditional African societies, that Marxists should look at them with sober eyes and appreciate what they are. They should not be denigrated. They had history, they had, they had their own life, they had their own history, but we should never idealize them, and we should never say that they were revolutionary forces or anything like that. So that is the program. And of course, for its time, it was revolutionary. It was no less revolutionary than other works written at that time, but the fact that it was a program and it was a congested sort of plan of studying Africa, a congested idea of how it should be done from the Marxist point of view, that of course made it so famous. Sikh, of course, just to continue the story, Sikh was a Hungarian who appeared in before the Soviet Union was created during the revolution and the Civil War, and he came as part of the occupation army. And found himself in the middle of the revolution somewhere in Siberia, and he looked at what was going on and decided to join the revolution. And so he moved to Moscow and ended up in Comintern. He started by studying and writing on racial issues, racial nationality questions. He published a book, I think, in 1933. Can't say now, which was called Nation, something like Racial Problem and the East. That is not the exact title. I just don't remember it now. But after that, he was asked to do Africa, and that's how it started. He later on, after the Second World War, he returned to Hungary and became foreign minister of the Socialist Hungary. His books, 3 volumes, they were published, they were written while he was in Moscow. He was writing them after he did this program, he was writing them in the 1930s and in the 1940s, but he dropped that work, and they remained unpublished. And when they were finally published in the late 1960s, early 1970s, they were totally outdated. There were mistakes, and even when there was a suggestion that they should be translated into Russian, but it was impossible to do that because there were very many outdated and simply wrong things. And so it never was.
So what I would like to know is, given this lacuna actually after the purges and these books that were written and not published for more than a decade, and you say African studies more or less disappeared, then we have Apollon Davidson entering Leningrad University in 1948. And now the question is, how did he come to African studies in that regard? If African studies had, if that was the lowest, one would say almost non-existing time within the Russian Academy.
Well, I wouldn't start with Apollon Davidson going to the university because that's a different matter. There was a period when there were African studies not concentrated in one institution, but at several. In the 1950s, there appeared a new interest in Africa. And I'm sorry, I just have to show you this volume. This huge, enormous tome, which is called Peoples of Africa, it was published in 1960, which means that it was written in the 1950s, and it was a collective work under the editorship of Alderoge and Petechin. And it was an encyclopedia, which, if you look at it, it was written in the same Marxist tradition, and moreover, there was this historical anthropological approach. There were chapters on African economy by country. There were essays on different peoples, different regions, etc. And they have created a map, ethnic map of Africa. I've never seen anything like that anywhere else. I have this map here, but I can't bring it because it's huge. It hangs somewhere there. Of course, it was in many ways wrong. For example, in South Africa, they put Afrikaners right across the whole South African region, together with here and there some African peoples. So that was an enormous achievement for the time also. Just think about it, 1960, what was created. So they worked in different institutes. Petechin worked in Moscow and at an academic institute which had nothing to do with African studies. But Alderoge stayed in Leningrad, and there were different other authors which they collected from different institutions. So there were some African studies, but there was very little of them. They were not concentrated in one place, and there were people who were senior to Apollon in terms of age and in terms of how long they studied Africa. Apollon, when he went to the university, it was Leningrad University, it was, he did not study Africa. Africa was not taught at that time, but he studied British Empire, international relations, and British colonies, etc., etc. So when he published, when he had his thesis, by the way, he studied under Olderoge, not officially, but unofficially, because he had a different, he could not have Olderoge as a supervisor, because they were in different academic institutes. But basically, he went to consult with Olderoge all the time. So he studied international relations, and his thesis was about British policy in Rhodesia. And when it came to publishing the book, he published it under the title Matabele and Mashona in the Struggle Against British Colonialism. His official supervisor told him, you know, I thought that you were a clever student, and you have decided to study archaeology. So basically, that was the attitude to African studies. It was somehow 1950s, not quite a lot of attention paid to it. But of course, then there was an upsurge of struggle for independence. And many African countries, after they got their independence, they were interested in building socialism. And that brought a lot of Soviet interest to Africa. So in 1960, Institute of African Studies, or Africa Institute, which exists now, became the main center of African studies, and Patechin was the first director of that institute, and Apollon and several other people from different other places, they all collected in that Africa Institute. So that was the beginning.